All right, what's up, Tuville? This is Bowhunter 1023. We're down in the workshop tonight. And if you remember the goals thread, I said I wanted to focus on different styles of content this year. And this is going to be one of the things that we're going to do a lot more is just some YouTube walkthroughs. This one particularly comes from an idea that Gordo had shared with me. It's been a couple years ago now. Made a comment regarding, using maps to scout for deer. And those of you who don't know, I was raised by a surveyor, so I've been in the woods since I was just a wee lad using topo maps to get through the woods. And it's probably a skill that I forsake when I was younger, but as I get older, it's turned into be a pretty valuable tool. And I take for granted that it's not something that somebody necessarily has ready in their skill set, and it's something that they need to learn and practice with. And we went to a really cool piece of public ground the other day that I think illustrates the use of maps ahead of time and then actually getting out and getting confirmation on the ground with a little bit of boot leather. So you can do your homework ahead of time, but until you actually get out there and lay boots on it, maps will only tell you a part of the story. So I mean, this kind of information's out there. I know the hunting public group's done this before. Everybody's got their spin on, their terms and what they call things and how what they're looking for in maps. So this is nothing that's revolutionary here. This is just from my perspective, growing up around maps and having, a deep appreciation for using those to navigate in the woods, particularly in the southeastern portion of the state, which is unique in terms of our topography in the rest of the state. You guys in the Northwest, this is, boring. Topography looks a lot different up there, especially on a USGS 20-foot contour map. So if you don't have access to something with smaller contours like 10s and 5s, the subtleties of that ground are missed on a topo map. You really just need to rely on the aerials to have an understanding of what the habitat looks like and get out and put your boots on the ground. But for those of you guys that have real topography and real terrain features that can vary tremendously, learning how to read these maps is an incredibly useful tool before you go into a piece of property. So I just wrote down some notes here. You'll see me glancing over here. I just want to stay on track with what I think is important. Some got make the assumption that guys know what a topo map is. U.S. Geological Survey. These show the variances in elevation and other land features in the out there in the terrain and the habitat. You'll see green coloration on those. If you get a standard USGS print, green is indicating vegetation, white's indicating open areas. A lot of your topo, the lines, the elevation, the contours will be in purple. Hydrological features will be in blue. You'll have brown for a lot of the indications of state and federal grounds. So you can find those all over. There's all kinds of maps out there. You can get maps that overlay on aerial like onX and HuntWise, HuntTerra, all of those, none of which are sponsored. So I'm just sharing what's out there. But hey, shout out to onX. I love you. And I'm going to give you some hype here. So I have an app on my phone called Azinza, and I can share that down below. Probably butchering the name, but you can get USGS topo maps on that. So one of the points that I'd make here is don't just rely on any one source of map, especially when you're looking at aerials. You can get on I think it's historicaerial.com and see, I think, aerial photography clear back into the 50s. I think that's an incredibly valuable resource. Download the PC version of Google Earth if you want the most up-to-date aerial photography, and use that in unison with what you're trying to figure out on these topos. Topos are unique. I'm going to use the onX platform here in a second. You're going to see those 20-foot contours overlaid on an aerial, which is the best of both worlds. But onX is lacking in their aerial photography in terms of it's dated at this point compared to what you get on Google Earth, but Google Earth isn't going to let you lay the same contours on there unless you have access to different files, which sometimes I can get having adapted as a surveyor. So that's the important part about just kind of what they are and where you go get them. I'm going to share my screen here. And this is one of the great benefits of COVID, right? Everybody gets set up to be able to do this virtual sort of conversation and training. So I apologize right now. My cursor is incredibly small and I cannot figure out how to fix that part. But if you look at 9 o'clock on the clock face. One of the most important things to keep in mind is just your general orientation, both in your cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, but also where your elevation is at. And so you'll see your markings here. When I talk about getting your barriers, follow me down at 6 o'clock on the cursor on the clock face. You'll see the cursor circling around that 900 mark. I know that that's lower than if I climb all the way back up here to, let's say, 11 o'clock on the clock face, you'll see the cursor around the 1,000-foot contour. I can also come back south a little bit down this right away here, and I can see, again, that 1,000-foot. So I know that that's roughly the top of the ridge. I'm going to climb up in elevation here, and we'll go through the specifics. But terminology is a good place to begin, because this section of property really has, most of everything you'd hear me talk about and discuss when you're looking at a topo map. It's absent some of the finer nuances that you'll see in steeper topography, such as secondary ridges and hogsbacks. If you go down further south and get down towards, let's say, the Portsmouth area, that topography is a totally different look than this, which is kind of getting up into that, you're southeast here of Columbus about an hour. So, some distinct ridges, and that's what we got along here. If you follow out this dotted line, I'm coming across from west to east right now in about the middle of the screen. I'm going to move towards that X marker, but you can see that trail kind of follows out this ridge, and it's pretty distinct. Here's our 1,000-foot reference again. This is a 20-foot contour map. So each jump from here to here is 20 feet in elevation. This is up on the ridge here. And you'll start to see this in your mind, I think. And, once you get a handle for these maps, you can really, you actually start to visualize this in your mind in terms of what it's really laying out like. But this is what we would call a knob or a point, high point in the ridge. I'm going to dive right into the best part of the map, and you hear guys talk about this all the time in terms of a saddle. This is a great indication here where the ridge is narrowing down, got a little bit of terrain pinching in right through here, and we're coming from 1,000 to 980 down to about 960. And if we start to work back to the west up the ridge, up this trail, we're going to pop back up to 980. We're going to drop back down into that similar 960 range. And then we're going to start to climb up the point back to 980, and then progressively climbing back up to our 1,000-foot mark as we work back to the west. So that's kind of what defines that ridge, right? We got these contours. Everything's running more or less east or west here. We're kicking down towards the 3 o'clock on this ridge, but you can see these contours are sliding off the ridge towards this lower elevation, this 900, which this becomes sort of, a bottom field at this point. And then it comes out to a really distinct nose of the ridge, right? You'll hear guys talk about that all the time, or coming out to the point. I'm over here, cursor on the 3 o'clock side of the screen now. This is another nice distinct feature here where just kind of got a knoll kind of rolling off right here, coming down the nose of the ridge, you could say too. A lot of guys will use that similar to references for similar types of terrain, right? When I say the nose of the ridge, right, it points out here, but at the same time, this little subtlety here is you got a little bit of a rounded, knoll or a knob here on this point, rounded. Here guys talk about a bowl, like a cereal bowl in topography. Some of that's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, you look at that, that's a half moon shape, right? If I slide back over here to the west to the 9 o'clock range, my cursor real fast, this is a classic example of a bowl, right? Its topography is wrapping up around what is a descending drainage, because we're working, this is the best example on this map, or one of the best right here. We're at 1,000 feet, and we are progressively going 980, 960, 940, 920, 900. Now we're getting down to like 880. We're dropping even further here to 860 to the lowest point down in here, right? So that's a classic example, coming back up here again to about the 10 or 11 o'clock on the west side of the map, coming down a drainage. It's a great example of it. And that's what's going to be inside that bowl when you wrap around on a terrain feature like that. In this particular instance, you're going to be able to pick up, again, the nuances of the aerials. You're going to be able to notice the terrain features that you should look for, like in this case, a saddle. Access is a lot of times evident because you can come down those drainages and get yourself into the bottom if you want to, kind of work through this big block of timber from down in the creek, or stay up on the ridge. And that trail, is pretty obvious. So if you get your boots on this piece of ground, the trail's mowed all the way out that ridge. And, if you park here, it's the most obvious way to walk in on this piece of property. But you're going to look for, south facing slopes. I'm down here around the 6 o'clock range, in between this 1,000 and 900 foot elevation. I can tell you, just kind of looking at the sign that I saw in there and how thick it was leading up in this general area, that south facing slope, I'm sure has some great bedding in it. I saw it back. If you see where these icons are, I walked through this creek bottom and picked up some excellent sign. There are some thick spots on that south facing point there that show excellent bedding. You can see the subtleties again. I'm down here kind of right in the middle of the clock dial now, below those 3 waypoints. But even a dated aerial such as this shows me that that's a different type of habitat, in terms of it's a different canopy. It's probably early successional growth. There's an overgrown field that way. You can see some of the larger canopies from the oaks here, particularly up on the ridge. If you look at that waypoint marked with the X, you can see those are some, especially if you zoom in on this picture, you can see the big canopy tops of what you can assume are oaks. And if you get down in there, that's what most of them are. But this is a really good area for getting a feel for, what topography looks like. And particularly when you go out and walk it, when you think about all the things that you've heard guys talk about, what saddles and south facing slopes, all of the sign here proved that out. I'm going to come back over to the 9 o'clock range and show you. We found a shed on this field that's right at the western edge of the photo right here. You come in here, this is some south facing bedding, same thing over in on this point, and it was just loaded with deer sign. So, it was kind of the obvious thing. If you follow right here at this 1,000-foot contour, and you come off, and this is what I would definitely call, the nose of this point. Same thing, right? Rounded section coming down off, creating a point. That trail was tremendous. And, you talk a lot of time about deer being lazy creatures by habit. And if you think about just coming off of a hill, this is just the natural tendency to flow that way and end up in this creek. And this is a gas line right away right here. And as you can imagine, that edge creates a nice bit of travel north and south through there. The nose of that point dropping off in there was very evident. And right here was a massive scrape. This is the biggest of the scrapes that I saw in this area. And so, again, that's something that you can see on the map ahead of time. And you can say, well, I love that edge. Deer are going to travel that. I can see that transition coming off the point from these fields up here is gradual and natural. You'll hear guys talk about a shelf too. Some are more evident than others. If you look at how far these contours are spaced from one another, that's the indication of steepness. The tighter, the steeper, the further apart, the flatter the topography feature is going to be. That's why you don't see, if you look in those fields, you don't see a lot of topo lines or contour lines in there, because they're flat. If you look on the edges of the ridges, it's probably something I should have pointed out much sooner, but you look particularly on the north side of that trail, that's the steepest portion of that ridge. You can see how the lines are the closest together. So that's a great indication of how steep and how flat you are dealing with particular ridges. So that's kind of the basics. it's the way I understand it. It's probably not everything. Hopefully this is a piece of information that's um, something, you guys like and enjoy. If there's specific questions that can be answered, I would be more than willing to cover some of what I've talked about here. I think practice makes perfect in terms of, getting out ahead of time, getting a feel for where you're going. Go find specific items on a map where find a saddle, right? That's, I think, one of the best things to do is to, find those narrow ridges, look for the high points in those ridges, look for, skinnier contours will indicate a narrowness in the ridge. But at the same time, if you're looking for elevation kind of dropping up and down and creating that kind of U shape, if you're looking at it straight on, go find one of those on a map and then go put boots on it. And, does it look the same in real life with your boots on the ground, standing there in the habitat as it did in your mind on the map? And you'll start to really kind of be able to compare and contrast, and you'll get better at reading these things. There's plenty of resources out there. Again, if you got questions, pop them down below and we'll try our best to address them. I appreciate it. Thanks, fellas.